What happens when Hollywood's most beloved underdog meets late-night television's most ruthless host? The answer might shock you. Tonight, we're diving into the explosive confrontation that left Sylvester Stallone walking off Stephen Colbert's show in disgust. And what really went down behind those studio lights will make you question everything you thought you knew about late-night TV. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below, because this story gets more unbelievable with every word. The Late Show studio was buzzing with its usual pre-show energy. Stallone had arrived early, something he always did out of respect for the crew and the process. At 77, the Rocky legend still carried himself with that unmistakable presence that had captivated audiences for decades. He was there to promote his latest project, a documentary about his father's immigrant journey to America, a deeply personal story that meant everything to him. Colbert swept into his dressing room with his usual theatrical flair. But something was different tonight. His assistant had briefed him on the talking points, the safe questions, the promotional beats they needed to hit. But Stephen had other plans. He'd been watching the political landscape shift, seeing how certain celebrities had become lightning rods for controversy, and he sensed an opportunity. "You know what?" Colbert said to his producer, adjusting his tie in the mirror. "Let's have some real fun tonight. I'm tired of these softball celebrity interviews. Time to see what the Italian stallion is really made of." The producer raised an eyebrow. "Stephen, he's here for the documentary." His publicist was very clear about keeping it focused on the project and his family story. Colbert's signature smirk spread across his face. "Oh, we'll talk about family. All right, we'll talk about the American family and what it really means in today's political climate." Meanwhile, Stallone sat in the green room quietly reviewing his notes about his father's story. This wasn't just another promotional appearance for him. This documentary represented years of research, hours of interviews with family members, and a deeply personal journey into his own heritage. He wanted to honor his father's memory and share the authentic immigrant experience that had shaped his own values. His publicist, Maria, paced nervously nearby. She'd been getting strange signals from the show's staff all afternoon. Questions that seemed to veer away from the agreed-upon topics, requests for additional background information that felt oddly political in nature. "Sly, I'm getting a weird vibe from this whole thing," she said, checking her phone for the third time in 5 minutes. "Maybe we should reconsider." Stallone looked up from his notes, his expression calm but focused. "Maria, I've been doing this for 50 years. I can handle Stephen Colbert. Besides, this story about my father, it needs to be told. People need to hear about the Real America, the one built by people who came here with nothing but hope and determination." The stage manager appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Stallone, we're ready for you." As Stallone made his way to the stage, the audience erupted in genuine applause. Here was a man who had given them Rocky, Rambo, and countless moments of inspiration. The energy was warm, respectful, almost reverent. Stallone waved, that familiar half-smile crossing his weathered face as he settled into the guest chair. Colbert's introduction had been smooth, professional, hitting all the right notes about Stallone's legendary career and his new documentary project. But as soon as the applause died down, something shifted in Colbert's demeanor. His posture became more aggressive, his smile more predatory. "So, Sylvester, let's talk about this documentary," Colbert began, leaning forward with exaggerated interest. "You're exploring your father's immigrant story. That's fascinating, especially in today's political climate where immigration has become such a divisive issue." Stallone nodded, settling into what he thought would be a straightforward conversation. "Absolutely, Stephen. My father came here from Italy with literally nothing. He worked construction. He struggled, but he believed in the American dream. This documentary is about that journey, that hope." Right, Colbert said, his tone already shifting slightly. "But let's be honest here, Sylvester. Your father's experience as a white European immigrant was quite different from what we're seeing today with immigrants from other parts of the world, wouldn't you say?" The question caught Stallone off guard. This wasn't in the pre-interview notes. This wasn't what they'd discussed. He could feel the energy in the room shift as the audience sensed the unexpected turn. "Well, Stephen, I think the experience of leaving everything behind, of starting over in a new country, that's universal. My father faced discrimination. He faced hardship. The Italian community wasn't always welcomed with open arms." Colbert's eyes lit up with what looked like predatory glee. "Oh, come on, Sylvester. Are you really going to compare the experience of Italian immigrants in the early 20th century to what's happening at our southern border today? Are you really going to sit there and pretend there's no difference? The studio audience began to murmur uncomfortably. This wasn't the light-hearted celebrity interview they'd expected. Stallone's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a sign that anyone who knew him would recognize as a warning. "Stephen, I'm not making comparisons. I'm talking about my father's story, about the values that built this country. Hard work, determination, respect for others." "Respect for others," Colbert repeated, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "That's interesting coming from someone who's made a career out of playing violent characters, glorifying warfare, promoting this whole toxic masculinity thing that's been so damaging to American culture." The tension in the studio was now palpable. Camera operators exchanged glances. The audience sat in stunned silence. Stallone's publicist watched from the wings, her face growing pale as she realized this interview was going completely off the rails. Stallone took a slow, measured breath. "Stephen, I came here to talk about my father. About family. About the documentary. If you want to attack my career choices, that's your right. But let's keep my family out of it." Colbert leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the moment. "Oh, but family is exactly what we need to talk about, isn't it? Because your whole brand is built on this nostalgic vision of America that frankly doesn't exist anymore. This mythical past where hard work automatically led to success, where everyone played by the same rules." "What are you talking about?" Stallone's voice carried a note of genuine confusion, mixed with growing irritation. "I'm talking about privilege, Sylvester. I'm talking about the fact that your father's story, while touching, represents a very specific kind of immigrant experience. White, European, Christian. Not exactly the full picture of what immigration looks like in America today." Stallone's hands gripped the arms of his chair. "My father worked 18-hour days laying concrete. He came here speaking no English. He built his life from nothing. And I'm sure he did," Colbert said with exaggerated sympathy. "But let's not pretend that experience is the same as a family fleeing violence in Central America or a Muslim family facing religious persecution. Your father had advantages that other immigrants simply don't have." The audience was completely silent now, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't comedy anymore. This wasn't entertainment. This was a confrontation, and it was getting uglier by the minute. Stallone's voice dropped to that familiar growl that had intimidated opponents on screen for decades. "Stephen, you don't know what you're talking about. You want to lecture me about privilege? My father slept on a cot in a boarding house for 2 years. He ate 1 meal a day so he could send money back to his family in Italy. Don't you dare minimize his struggle." But Colbert wasn't backing down. If anything, Stallone's obvious anger seemed to energize him further. "I'm not minimizing anything, Sylvester. I'm providing context. Your father came here during a time when being white and European meant something very different than it does for immigrants today. That's not his fault, but it's the reality." "Reality?" Stallone's voice rose slightly. "You want to talk about reality? The reality is that my father worked his hands bloody building the infrastructure of this country. The reality is that he was grateful every single day for the opportunity to make something of himself. He didn't complain. He didn't make excuses. He just worked." Colbert's smile became even more condescending. "And that's a beautiful story. It really is very inspiring, very traditional. But don't you think it's a little tone-deaf to be promoting this bootstrap mentality when we know that systemic barriers make it much harder for certain groups to achieve that same success?" The audience was shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Several people in the front row looked genuinely distressed by the hostile turn the conversation had taken. This wasn't what they'd signed up for when they came to see a late-night comedy show. Stallone leaned forward, his famous intensity now fully engaged. "Tone-deaf? Let me tell you what's tone-deaf, Stephen. What's tone-deaf is you sitting in your comfortable studio, making millions of dollars, and lecturing a 77-year-old man about his father's sacrifice. What's tone-deaf is you turning a story about family and perseverance into some kind of political attack." "Political attack?" Colbert laughed. But there was no humor in it. "I'm asking legitimate questions about the narrative you're promoting. This whole anyone can make it if they just work hard enough message is exactly the kind of thinking that allows people to ignore the structural inequalities that keep people down." "Structural inequalities," Stallone repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. "You know what kept people down? Giving up. Making excuses. My father could have stayed in Italy and complained about how unfair life was. Instead, he took a chance on America. Colbert's producer was frantically signaling from the wings, making cutting motions across his throat. But Colbert either didn't see or didn't care. He was in full attack mode now, and nothing was going to stop him. But Sylvester, don't you see how problematic that attitude is? When you say people just need to work harder, you're implying that those who haven't achieved success simply haven't tried hard enough. That's victim blaming at its worst. Stallone's face was reddening now, and his voice carried a dangerous edge. Victim blaming? Are you out of your mind? I'm talking about taking responsibility for your own life. I'm talking about not waiting for someone else to solve your problems. And I'm talking about acknowledging that not everyone starts from the same place, Colbert shot back. Your father's story is inspiring, but it's also the story of someone who had certain advantages that many immigrants today simply don't have. Advantages? Stallone's voice was incredulous. What advantages? He spoke no English. He had no money. He had no connections. He had nothing but his willingness to work. He had the right skin color, Colbert said bluntly. He came from the right continent. He practiced the right religion. Those aren't small things, Sylvester. The studio fell into complete silence. Even the crew members stopped what they were doing. The camera operators zoomed in instinctively, capturing every nuance of Stallone's reaction to what everyone recognized as a deeply offensive comment. Stallone sat back in his chair, his expression shifting from anger to something approaching disgust. Unbelievable. You just reduced my father's entire life, his entire struggle, to the color of his skin. You took everything he accomplished, everything he sacrificed, and you dismissed it because of his race. I'm not dismissing anything, Colbert insisted. But his voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments before. I'm providing historical context. Historical context? Stallone's laugh was bitter. You want historical context? Here's some context for you. My father was called a Dago. He was told to go back where he came from. Italian Americans were lynched in this country, Stephen. They were discriminated against. They were treated like second-class citizens. Colbert's smugness was beginning to crack. That's different and you know it. Different how? Stallone demanded. Because it doesn't fit your narrative? Because it complicates your neat little categories. Because it was a different time, Colbert said weakly. A different time? Stallone repeated mockingly. So discrimination against Italians doesn't count because it happened in a different time. But somehow my father's success is diminished because of advantages he never actually had. The host was clearly struggling now, his usual quick wit seemingly abandoned. Sylvester, you're twisting my words. I'm repeating your words, Stallone fired back. You said my father had advantages because of his skin color. You said his story doesn't matter as much because he was white and European. Those were your words, not mine. Colbert tried to regain control of the conversation. What I'm saying is that we need to be honest about the different experiences people have had in this country. Honest. Stallone's voice was rising again. You want to be honest? Let's be honest about what you're really doing here. You invited me on your show to talk about my father's documentary, and instead you're using it as an opportunity to push your political agenda. You're disrespecting my family's story to score cheap points with your audience. I'm not disrespecting anyone, Colbert protested, but his voice lacked conviction. You absolutely are, Stallone said firmly. You're sitting there telling me that my father's hard work doesn't matter because he was white. You're telling me that his struggles don't count because they happened in a different era. You're reducing a human being to nothing but his race and his religion. The tension in the studio was now almost unbearable. Audience members were looking at each other in confusion and discomfort. This had gone far beyond uncomfortable television. This was a genuine confrontation between two men with fundamentally different worldviews. Colbert made one last attempt to salvage the situation. Sylvester, I think you're misunderstanding what I'm trying to say. No, Stephen, I understand perfectly, Stallone replied coldly. You're trying to rewrite history to fit your politics. You're trying to divide people instead of bringing them together. You're trying to tear down the very values that made this country great. Values like what? Colbert asked, his voice taking on a mocking tone again. Values like respect, Stallone said simply. Values like dignity. Values like treating people as individuals instead of just members of racial categories. Colbert's mask was completely off now. His pretense of journalistic inquiry abandoned for pure ideological warfare. Oh, please, Sylvester, spare me the civics lesson. Those values you're talking about, that whole rugged individualism thing, it's exactly what's wrong with this country. It's what allows people to ignore systemic injustice. Stallone's eyes narrowed dangerously. Systemic injustice. You want to talk about injustice? The injustice is you sitting there in your ivory tower, making millions of dollars by dividing Americans against each other. The injustice is you using your platform to tear down people who actually built something with their lives. I'm not tearing anyone down, Colbert insisted, but his voice was getting shrill. I'm asking important questions about privilege and opportunity. No, you're not, Stallone said, his voice now deadly calm. You're doing something much worse than that. You're trying to destroy the idea that hard work and determination matter. You're trying to convince people that they're victims instead of encouraging them to fight for their dreams. The audience was transfixed by the raw emotion on display. This wasn't scripted television anymore. This was two men having a fundamental disagreement about the nature of America itself, and it was playing out in real time on national television. Colbert, perhaps realizing he was losing the room, tried to pivot. Sylvester, I think we're getting off track here. Let's talk about your documentary. What do you hope people take away from your father's story? But Stallone wasn't having it. The damage was done, and he wasn't going to let Colbert off the hook. Oh no, Stephen. We're not changing the subject now. You started this conversation, and we're going to finish it. You want to know what I hope people take away from my father's story? I hope they learn that America is still the land of opportunity for anyone willing to work for it. But that's exactly the kind of naive thinking that, Colbert began. But Stallone cut him off. Naive? Stallone's voice exploded with fury. Naive? You think it's naive to believe in the American dream? You think it's naive to believe that people can overcome obstacles and build better lives for themselves and their families? I think it's naive to pretend that everyone has the same opportunities, Colbert shot back, his own anger finally showing through. Stallone stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that echoed through the silent studio. You know what, Stephen? I've heard enough. I came here to honor my father's memory, to share a story about hope and perseverance, and you've turned it into a political hit job. The audience gasped audibly. No one had ever walked out on Stephen Colbert before. The host himself looked genuinely shocked, his usual composure completely shattered. Sylvester, please sit down. Let's continue the conversation, Colbert said. But there was panic in his voice now. Continue what conversation? Stallone demanded, his voice carrying to every corner of the studio. You don't want a conversation, Stephen. You want a lecture platform. You want to use my family's story as a springboard for your political agenda. Colbert was scrambling now, clearly realizing that he had pushed too far. I'm just trying to provide different perspectives on immigration and opportunity in America. Different perspectives? Stallone's laugh was harsh and bitter. You mean your perspective? The perspective that says my father's sacrifice doesn't matter because he was born with the wrong skin color. The perspective that reduces human beings to racial categories instead of seeing them as individuals. The show's producer was making frantic gestures from behind the cameras, but it was too late. This train wreck was happening live, and there was no stopping it now. Stallone began walking toward the edge of the stage. You know what the real problem is, Stephen? People like you have forgotten what made this country great. It wasn't government programs. It wasn't identity politics. It was people like my father who came here with nothing and built something through sheer determination. Sylvester, please, Colbert called after him, his voice now genuinely pleading. Let's finish the interview. Stallone turned back one final time, his eyes blazing with righteous anger. The interview is over, Stephen, and so is any respect I might have had for you or your show. You've shown your true colors tonight, and they're uglier than I ever imagined. What are you talking about? Colbert asked desperately. I'm talking about the fact that you invited me here under false pretenses, Stallone said, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades commanding movie sets and demanding respect. You told my people this would be about the documentary about my father's story. Instead, you ambushed me with your political garbage. The studio audience was completely silent, many of them looking genuinely disturbed by what they had witnessed. This wasn't the Stephen Colbert they thought they knew. This wasn't the witty, charming host who usually made them laugh. This was someone else entirely, someone petty and mean-spirited and divisive. Colbert made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Sylvester, I'm sorry if you feel I was unfair. That wasn't my intention. Stallone stopped at the edge of the stage and looked back at the host with undisguised contempt. Your intention was crystal clear, Stephen. Your intention was to tear down everything my father represented because it doesn't fit your narrative about America. Your intention was to use your platform to divide people instead of bringing them together. That's not true, Colbert protested weakly. It's absolutely true, Stallone replied. And the worst part is you're doing it in front of all these people who came here expecting to be entertained, not lectured to about racial politics and privilege theory. He gestured toward the audience, many of whom were nodding in agreement. These people deserve better than what you gave them tonight. They deserve honesty. They deserve respect. They deserve a host who cares more about entertaining them than pushing his political agenda. With that, Sylvester Stallone walked off the Late Show stage, leaving Stephen Colbert sitting alone at his desk, facing an audience that was clearly uncomfortable with what they had just witnessed. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every awkward second of silence that followed. Colbert attempted a weak smile and said, "Well, folks, that was certainly unexpected. We'll be right back after these messages." But everyone in that studio knew that something fundamental had changed. The mask had slipped and America had seen the real Stephen Colbert, the man behind the carefully crafted television persona. And what they saw wasn't pretty. The legend had walked out, and in doing so, he had exposed the ugly truth about late-night television's descent into political propaganda. Sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is simply refusing to participate in someone else's agenda. What did you think about this explosive confrontation? Was Stallone right to walk out, or should he have stayed and continued the fight? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more stories that reveal the truth behind Hollywood's biggest moments.